So, doctor, just as a general question, you obviously have said that you read multiple books in parallel. You break a lot of the general tenets that young Indians are taught when it comes to reading books. That you have to read a book from start to finish. There are a lot of these myths that, as one grows up, they bust for themselves. That it's absolutely not true. You can throw books away if you're not interested. You can pick them back up when it's relevant. So, can you talk to me a little bit about your journey as a reader first, and then I want to talk to you about some books that have changed your life.
Okay, I think that's a great question. As you quite correctly said, I have a soft corner for books. And I think the amount of knowledge which is packed in books, whether you're talking about how to learn a particular domain, whether you're talking about how to learn your life, to lead your life, whether it's philosophy, spirituality, there is actually nothing which you can't find in a book. And I think for 300 rupees, 500 rupees, the amount of knowledge which you get, and honestly, that's my preferred mode of consumption for multiple reasons. For one thing, a book doesn't have a hidden agenda. I'm not saying books don't have agendas. Obviously, an author has a particular perspective and has a particular point of view. You need to be able to sophisticate it enough to understand that. But he's not trying to extract money from you. Whereas when you talk to a professional, you're lucky you have a trusted professional. I think that's fine. But it's not very easy to find trusted professionals. As a result of which, I think books play such an important role. They provide you with a basic foundation. So that's what I call, when I tell all my patients, I call it what I call information therapy. So at least you know enough so that then when you need to engage with a professional, the quality of questions which you can ask that professional is increased dramatically. And I think that's why it's so important to have a goal when you read. You cannot use the same style when you're reading any book. So the way I would read a fiction book obviously is very different from the way I would read a non-fiction book. The way I would read a book about IVF would be very different from, let's say, a book I would read about investing. And I think we need to be able to have that agility and to have that flexibility. I think a lot of the problems, very honestly, start in school. And I'm more and more coming to that conclusion is that so many of these bad habits are so deeply ingrained in us because of our schooling. And the worst thing is we don't even realize that these are bad habits, that they're being deeply ingrained. And what's even worse is we are inflicting exactly the same shortcomings on our kids, which is actually going to make a bad situation much worse. And I'll come back to that. The point of a book is it's a tool like anything else. It's a tool for you to extract whatever information you want. Now, the way I read a book will be different from the way you read a book. The way I read a book today will be different if I revisit that book 5 years from now. And I think we need to understand some of this stuff. You don't need to be a slave to the book. The book needs to be a slave to you, which means you need to read actively. And there's lots of techniques which have been described. First skim through a book, have your lattice work, your mental models in your framework, so to say, and then decide where that book fits. And there are often chapters which you already know enough about. Reading the book doesn't add any value. Skip those chapters. Move to where the points are. If the book is not engaging you, you're not going to learn from the book. And then if reading the book is becoming a punishment, if it's a chore, if you have to think, oh God, I have another 100 pages, when am I ever going to get over this? Please leave that book, because it's not fair on the book, it's not fair on the author, and it's definitely not fair on you. And you will find lots of other books which will appeal to you. And I'm a big believer in the concept of what I call the anti-library. The anti-library is the books you buy, but which you haven't read yet. Because you know what? Whenever you need to find that information, you know that that book is there. So I think it's perfectly okay to adapt your reading style to meet what your learning needs are at that point. So first start with the end in mind. Start with your goal. What do I want to read this book for? Do I just want to introduce myself to the domain, or do I already know this and there are some gaps which I'm trying to fill up? For me, that's one of the reasons why I enjoy LinkedIn in the past and Twitter these days. Because I then start reading very actively. I try to distill the information. And I try to distill the information in a way which not only will make sense to me, but also will make sense to so many other people who are following me. As a result of which, I think the reading becomes much more active. And I think that's the secret sauce. There is passive reading, like watching TV, where you're just absorbing information and you hope that that information will get absorbed by osmosis. Sadly, that doesn't work. But of course, there's the active reading, where you're actively engaged in a conversation with the author. Why did you say that? You know what? I don't agree. I read that book 2 years ago and he had a very different point of view. Hey, I'm reading three books and each book has something else to say. Or I couldn't understand this paragraph at all from this book, but this book made it all crystal clear. And I think, the great thing about exponential anything, the value of compounding, as Warren Buffett says, is everything compounds exponentially. Sadly, your weight also compounds, not exponentially, linearly, hopefully at some point. But or other than that, kidding apart, wealth compounds exponentially, but your learning compounds exponentially. And the more you read, the easier it becomes to read. But the trouble is, we force kids to read when they're not ready, when they don't want to read. They become allergic to reading. They hate reading. When you insist, you tell a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, you have to know the alphabet, you have to cram this. And it's actually become a bit of a status symbol and a competition in amongst parents. Oh, your kid is only reading a book which has 10 pages. My kid reads a book which has 100 pages. Oh, your kid will learn to read when it interests your kid. Trust me, it'll happen. It doesn't matter if your kid doesn't is interested till 8 years now. And if you let it happen organically and naturally, it'll be much more fun for your kid and much less pain for you. So let me give you an example. Suppose your kid loves playing with, let's say, Lego toys and tinkering and assembling or whatever it may be, and he hates reading. That's fine. Don't force him. But at some point he will realize that if I need to assemble the next set of Lego toys, I need to read the manual. Initially, perhaps he will watch a video. He will watch a video to get, because that's his preferred learning style. But after a particular point, he'll say, you know what, I need to know more. And then if you're smart and you buy a book on how to assemble Legos and you leave it lying around the house, you'll catch him reading and looking at the pictures and trying to figure out how the words work and stuff. And after a few months, he'll want to start writing about his experiences because he will want to show his friends, hey, this is how much I can do or this is how much I know. The whole point is that all of us are social animals. All of us are learning machines. Just watch the way a baby who learns before they go to school, and they will automatically absorb so much information because they can't survive without learning. It's only when we send them to school and we force them to do things which they don't want to do that they start hating learning. And the first casualty is often reading. And I've come across adults who will do anything but refuse to read a book. And they don't even understand how much pleasure they're depriving themselves for. And I honestly feel sad for them. And it's like Mark Twain said, what's the difference between an illiterate man and a man who can read and refuses to read? So I think it's just a big tragedy. And I'm more and more convinced that trying to address these problems at a college level is never going to help, because those habits have become so deeply ingrained that you really need to start addressing them at a much earlier stage, and the sooner the better. Some of it is you have to repair the damage which schooling has done, but if you can actually address a lot of these problems before, I think then schools will automatically start changing. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but more importantly, kids will not get influenced by some of the wrong things which they're being taught. They will understand, maybe yes, that's right, that's one way of doing things, but that's not the only way of doing things. There is a better way of doing things, and I need to find out what works for me. And I don't have to do everything just because Mrs. Patel in the geography class tells me this is what I need to do.